Good morning. I've got to get this off my chest. I've just noticed something really, really odd about this slide. My title and my subtitle line up exactly on both ends. Not intentional at all, really weird, and it's really put me off. Sorry. I'm Steve Marshall. I'm a technical architect for the Ministry of Justice. And if you're not aware, the Ministry of Justice is part of the UK government that runs prisons and courts and basically ensures that the justice system in the UK that we've had for about 900 years now keeps working and improving and, changing all the time. And you're probably thinking, I'm a little bit underdressed for that job, right? I should have like a tricorn hat or a cape or something. But it is what it is. Let's move on. I'm going to be talking about a service that we've built in the Ministry of Justice that has about 85% user satisfaction, 65-ish% mobile and tablet use, and 80% completion, but is backed by a 15-year-old monolith that's not connected to the internet. By understanding our users' needs and choosing when to and not to use technology, we've been able to iteratively implement citizen-facing services without ever having to touch that backend monolith. And I'm also going to give you some examples of other well-known organizations who've used similarly low-tech solutions to solve their users' needs. And then finally, I'll talk to you a little bit about how we've used the system we've built to start unpicking that monolith and taking it apart. But first, I'd like to give you some background. In 2011, a small group was formed within the heart of the UK's government in the Cabinet Office, and they were called the Government Digital Service. And the Government Digital Service's mission was to transform government services to be digital by default. Now, digital by default is kind of a weird phrase, right? But essentially it means digital services, online services, so good that people prefer to use them. And the example that the Government Digital Service, GDS, used to use was that of British Airways. It used to be the case that if you wanted to fly with British Airways, you would go into a travel agent, not an estate agent, that would be weird. You'd go into a travel agent and say, I would like to fly with British Airways. And they would then do some stuff and fill out some forms and book you a ticket through some arcane means, and they would book you a flight with British Airways. If you want to do that now, you go to ba.com, you say, I want to fly on this date, I want to come back on this date, maybe, and I want to go from here to here. And within a couple of minutes, you've got yourself a flight. That's digital by default. It's a service that works brilliantly online and that was kind of hamstrung by the old world. So one of the first things that GDS did was they reinvigorated and rebuilt all of the the main citizen-facing websites for government and built a service called GovUK. And GovUK offers content for citizens, information about all the sorts of things that you might need to know to be a citizen in the UK. And then after they'd made a good amount of progress on GovUK, in January 2013, they announced what they called their transformation program. And the transformation program identified 25 major services across government, across 8 departments within government, to transform into digital services. Now, government services in the UK, as probably everywhere in the world, historically have been very archaic, paper-based or face-to-face, or maybe over the phone if you're lucky. And GDS's idea was that a lot of these, possibly all, should be digital by default. And as part of that transformation, the services should be redesigned so that instead of focusing on what the government needs to get out of this, they should be focused on the citizens' needs and the users' needs. I'm not going to go into all 25 of those because that would be kind of weird and boring. But what I will do is talk to you about a couple that are really interesting, and then I'll talk to you about the one that I was involved with. So first off, we've got registering to vote. It used to be that if you wanted to register to vote in the UK, every year the local council would send out a piece of card to your house, and the head of your household, whoever that might be, if you're living in a house share or something like that, would fill out that card saying, these people live at this address and are eligible to vote. They would send it back to the council, and the council would add those people to the electoral roll, the list of people who are allowed to vote. And there are some problems with that, right? It assumes that your head of household I don't know, isn't a vindictive, weird person who wants to stop you being able to vote for whatever reason. Or, you know, that they don't hold some belief that means that they think you shouldn't. I don't know. So, as part of the transformation program, the Register to Vote team at GDS built a service that allowed people to vote online and also had the law changed to allow individuals to register themselves to vote. So it's now possible, thanks to this service, to go online and in a couple of minutes register yourself to vote in the UK, assuming obviously you live in the UK and are eligible to vote and all of these sorts of things. But of course, you know, it will tell you on this page, slightly further down, actually if you're eligible, so you don't waste your time saying, I'm registering to vote, but actually you don't live in the UK and aren't eligible to register. Or there's carers allowance, another exemplar. Carers allowance, if you're not aware, is a benefit that the government provides to people who look after their friends or family who are very ill, sometimes terminally ill. And to apply for carers allowance, you used to have to fill in a long and complicated paper form that took multiple hours to do. And the team who built the carers allowance service cut the number of questions in that form by half, which is like they removed 170 questions and reduced the time that it took to fill in the application dramatically. But at the same time, they built an online service that people can fill in how and when they like. So they can do it on their computers, on, you know, a desktop machine, or they can do it on their phone when they're on the bus, when they're going between their day job, which they probably have, to go and see the person who they care for full-time, as well as their full-time job. And this is crucial because these people really don't have much time in their lives to spare. So reducing the amount of time that things take and making it fit around their life is really important. So those are a couple of the services, but the one that I've been most involved with is prison visit booking. And you might be thinking, why are prison visits important? You know, these people have done something wrong maybe, and they're there to make up for their crime. But they're still people, right? They still should be able to see their friends and family. They should get these benefits. But 45% of people, of prisoners, lose contact with their family while they're in prison, which is really sad. And by the way, there will be links to studies at the end of my slides, and my slides will be on, well, my slides are already online, but there's a link to them at the end of my presentation. And people in prison are 39% more likely to reoffend if they're not visited. So it's actually really bad for their chances of staying outside and living a, you know, a normal, productive life. And it's bad for society as well. It used to be the case that if a prisoner wanted to be visited, they would have to request a copy of this form or something very like it from one of the staff who worked on the prison wing that they were living in. And this form is what's known as a convicted visiting order form. And so they would fill this form in with their name and their prisoner number and their location, so which cell they're in which prison. And then they would have to fill out, from memory probably, because they might not have any of their belongings yet, because they might be newly into prison, the details, the name, correctly, because it has to match the passport of the person who's visiting them, the date of birth, again, correctly, because it has to match the passport of the person who's visiting them, and the address of the person they want to visit them, for every single person they want to visit them in a, you know, in a particular visit. And each time they want someone to visit them, they have to fill this form out again. And then they give this form to the prison staff, to the guard on their wing, for example, and that member of staff takes it to someone who works in the prison office, and probably the next day, maybe the day after, depending on how busy they are, the person in the office will put this into an envelope and post it with a second-class stamp, because with the government we have to save money. And so that will take, let's say, 10 days to get to the visitor. And then the visitor receives this, and they have to, in some cases, send a letter to the prison to say, I would like to visit the prison because they've asked me to visit them and I think that might be nice for them. Or if they're really lucky, they might be able to call. And when they contact the prison staff will either say, yes, you can visit on the day that you would like to come and visit. Or no, I'm sorry, we've got too many people visiting that day already, so you can't come and visit that day, sorry. And of course, if they're sending a letter, you know, if it's on the phone, that's fine, because they can have a back and forth, and they can work out which days they actually can make. But if they're sending a letter, it might take a couple of weeks for this back and forth to happen. And this is something that, you know, staff and visitors told us over and over again. You know, people were saying they had called the visitor booking lines 50 times and couldn't get through. Because actually it turns out that a lot of the booking lines are only open for a few hours a day. And they're not open at, sociable hours so that you can call in the evening while you're making dinner or on a Saturday morning. They're open in office hours, like really narrowly specified office hours. Or people said, get more staff on the phones, because there are only a few people available in the prison to answer the phones at any one time. And so actually we were routinely hearing about people waiting on the phone to try to book a visit to see someone they loved in prison for 2 or 3 or 4 hours at a time. And you're probably thinking, 2 hours a year, so what? But some of these people aren't like visiting the person in prison once a year. Some of these people are visiting their spouses or their children's parents or their own parents in prison. So they want to see them once a week or once a fortnight maybe. So they're making a 2-hour phone call, say, every week or every fortnight. So in 2014, in September, we launched the prison visit booking service, or visit someone in prison, as it's normally known. And since we launched prison visit booking in 2014, it's had about 1.5 million bookings made against it online. And actually now 50% of all bookings are made through prison visit booking. And 65% of those online bookings, through all time, are from mobile devices or tablets. Again, this kind of reflects that people are doing it when they're on the go, these sorts of things. And we have an 80% completion rate. And most of that 20% drop-off is on the first page, because people come to the service, they see, oh, I need the date of birth for my friend who's coming with me, say. I'll go and get that first. So actually this is really good, this is really high, because they come back when they have all the information they need. And we have 85% user satisfaction. This 85% sounds like, where's the other 15%? But actually, if you compare to some really highly rated products, highly regarded products have sort of 60, 70% sometimes. And we're including people who didn't get their booking slot, who were told, I'm sorry, the booking that you tried to make through Prison Visits booking service isn't available anymore. So these people are, going to be upset, they're going to be frustrated, and we're still hitting 85%. So how did we make this? You're probably sitting there thinking, well, that's easy, right? You have a person who wants to visit someone in prison, hits a website, and that registers a visit in a database. But unfortunately, we're in the government. It's not that easy. We already have a system that runs our prisons. We have a monolithic database application that has been there running prisons for 10 years. And we already have call center staff, the people who are on the phone with 2-hour-long waits, who are handling visit bookings, putting them into the database. We have prison staff who are managing the prisoners' lives, so things like, do we need to move this prison from this cell to this cell because they've had an argument with their neighbour? Are they vegan or are they vegetarian? Have they had some sort of bullying going on? How much money do they have in their bank account? Because, of course, they need to buy toiletries or books or magazines or whatever. But also, okay, this prisoner's being visited by these people today. So, they print out every morning a list of who's visiting whom in the prison. So we can't just say, all of the visit data goes into its own database and we retrain all of these people, because that's a problem. And this system's not connected to the internet, because 10 or 15 years ago, prevailing wisdom was, if you have data that's sensitive, you don't connect it to the internet, you put it in a big building somewhere secret and you put guard dogs around it. And you're probably thinking, yeah, but we own that building and we own that database, so we can just change those rules, right? But that's often not true in government. In government, these things are often bought from a supplier on a very long contract that's incredibly hard and incredibly expensive to change. And that supplier outsources it to someone else that has a contract that's incredibly long and incredibly hard to change. And we can't just end that contract, because then they'll turn off the systems and then we don't have a prison system. So what can we do? Well, we can ask those suppliers how much and how long for an API to that database, right? And as we all know, if we look in a dictionary or something like that, an API is an FTP folder with a 10-minute response time. Or at least this is what we get told by our suppliers. We get told that there's, the best thing they can give us is an FTP folder with 10-minute response. So you put a file here saying which visits you want to book, and then 10 minutes later another file appears here that you need to watch for that tells you whether or not it's been successful. And by the way, that's going to cost you about £500,000, and it'll take maybe 6 months, but probably a year, just to be on the safe side. So obviously we didn't go for that, but let's imagine for a second that we did. And this is what the system that we're talking about here. We have an unsatisfied visitor going to a website that talks to a thing that gives us responses in 10 minutes, and then ultimately books a visit in the database. Now, if you look back at the principles of usability engineering, as Jakob Nielsen laid them out in the early 90s, he talks about how users consider the response of a system. So if a system responds in about 1/10 of a second or less, it's considered to be instantaneous. It feels like, you know, they're at one with the system and they're in flow and all this sort of thing. And if it responds in a second or so, they feel like they're directly operating on the data. But 10 seconds is the limit for keeping their users' attention. So what does that mean for our 10 minutes? It means that they're going to piss off and they're going to use Facebook or just phone up the visit center, and so they're going to ignore our website. So we can't do this. But interestingly, if we shift the expectation from you are making a booking on the website to you are requesting a visit on the website, that allows them to get on with their day, because we can tell them later, using an email, that yes, your visit's been approved, or no, I'm sorry, your visit's been rejected. So if they're requesting a visit and they can go on and do what they want and carry on with their day, they're happy. You know, they won't be quite so happy if they get rejected, but at least they haven't wasted 10 minutes sitting there looking at a spinner, forgotten that it's spinning, gone to Facebook and then lost their booking, or something like that. But the thing is, if the users can't get an instant response, they don't actually care that much if it's 10 minutes or 10 hours or a little bit longer, because all they want is to either have a response or get on with their day. But I'll come back to that, because there's another problem here. Because if these visitors are, you know, selecting a date and sending it into this 10-minute delayed queue, what happens if the date's already been picked? Because we've got these call center staff who are making bookings live on this system. You know, we have no way of communicating with this visitor because they've moved on to say, sorry, you've actually missed out on that because someone on the phones has taken that slot. What then? You know, it turns out that these booking center staff quite often will take the last slot on a day and then suddenly no one else can book for that because there's only limited space in prisons for visits. And of course, they're working directly on the database, so they get priority. So just think about that for a moment. This is actually a problem that we used to set for people in interview questions. I guess we're going to have to change that now. But think about that. What happens if we've got these people working live on the database and then someone comes in and tries to make a booking? It's, you know, basically a write after write type problem, right? And in interviews, what people typically come up with is, well, I'll start pre-caching the availability based on an API that is going to cost another £500,000 and 6 to 12 months. Or I'll build some machine learning to predict busy periods based on my usage, or, you know, some other fancy, whizzy stuff that will take lots and lots of effort. Or we could, you know, make the booking staff go through the same API, but that's not going to work because they've already got 2 hours of delays on the phones, so they're going to be even slower by this 10-minute API. So what we did is we looked at our user research. And it turns out that when we talked to people in user research, they talked about this back and forth. You know, they talked about calling the phones or calling the phone lines or sending letters and getting rejected the first time, and so suggesting another date. So we gave them that option on the website. We presented interfaces that allow them to say, I'd like to visit on this day, but if I can't get that date, then I'll come on this day. If I can't get that date, then I'll come on another day. So I'd like to visit my friend in prison on this Saturday, but if that's busy, then I'll come on Sunday or the Saturday after. And then we have our service pick the best match. So if the first date that they want is busy, then they can come on the second or the third. And so they've got a significantly higher chance of having a day that they can visit. But it also turns out that the booking staff can receive emails. And we already know that they've got the ability to edit the prison database in real time. So what we built instead of that API is this. We had visitors go to a website, and they pick 3 dates that they would like to visit someone in prison, and they get an email telling them that their request has been accepted. And at the same time, the call center staff, who are already working on the database live because they're on the phones, get an email saying, someone's requested a visit. Can you deal with it, please? And so they can then deal with those visitors' requests that were made online in the database, log them in the database, and then respond through our service to the visitor saying, we've booked your visit, and we will see you on Saturday. And our prison staff can carry on working as they always have, printing out the list of who is visiting whom today, tomorrow, whenever. And everyone's happy. And this has a turnaround, depending on which prison you look at, because each prison has their own call centre staff, of somewhere between 2 hours and 2 days, or thereabouts. You know, sometimes it fluctuates up and down. But we weren't hamstrung at any point by our monolith. We didn't have to, spend 6 months integrating with something and then find out that actually the thing that we'd been integrating with that our suppliers told us was going to be how the API worked was actually dramatically different from the thing they delivered. We didn't have to retrain people. We didn't have to work through major network issues. What we did instead is we built a thing that was connected using people and built a service that has 85% user satisfaction and, ridiculously happy users on both sides of the equation. And everyone can get on with their day. The visitors can request a booking and go on with their day knowing that they are probably going to get to visit the person when they've said they would like to visit. They don't have to sit on a phone waiting for hours. They can make a booking at 3 a.m., which they couldn't before. And we've been able to iterate on our service and improve it for everyone as we go along, while the monolith just sits there creaking and aging and creaking and aging. And we didn't have to spend loads of money improving it either. So I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that you should use low or no-tech solutions first. We've had people connecting our front and our back end, and we never had to connect the thing we were trying to integrate with that we didn't really control, even though the contract said we did. And our users are happy, and we didn't waste time or money. And the point is, satisfying the user's need doesn't have to be instant. By setting that expectation of you will get a response within a couple of days, they made their request, and they went on with their life. And then when they got the response to their request, they were happy because they'd got a visit with their brother or their cousin or their friend or whoever. So I've talked a little bit about the service we built in the Ministry of Justice for allowing people to visit their friends or family in prison. And you're probably thinking, well, so what? You're the government, you've got these weird problems. Other people don't do this sort of thing. Other people just build the right technology the first time, because everyone does that. But let's talk about some other services with low-tech solutions. So you might have heard of Duolingo. Duolingo is a completely free language learning tool, and they have about 60 language courses that they supply to 120-ish million users around the world. So these might be for learning Spanish if you're an English speaker, or learning French if you're a Dutch speaker, or lots of things like this. And they have about 60 employees. And they made their language learning service free to everyone because the way that people learn on Duolingo is by translating fragments of documents. So if I'm learning Spanish, Duolingo presents me with an English phrase and says, translate this into Spanish. And then they might say to a Spanish learner, here's this Spanish phrase that I've translated that has been deemed to be correct by the community. Here's a Spanish phrase, translate it into English. And then they validated that my translation was correct, or they might say to that Spanish learner, or that English learner who speaks Spanish, translate this English phrase into Spanish to validate what I've said. And so they're using their 120 million users to do human-powered translation. And then they sell these translations, and they sell this translation capability to people like CNN and BuzzFeed. So, for example, BuzzFeed used Duolingo to translate their English content into Portuguese for Brazil. Now, admittedly, Duolingo are moving on from this business model to other business models that are more lucrative, apparently, like language certification and content for schools. But they used to use people to power other sites' translations. Or there's Stripe. Stripe are, as many of you probably are aware, the darlings of the API scene at the moment. And Stripe is a service that provides card payment processing for web and app developers. And when they first started up, they had this service that you could really easily use their API to throw credit card numbers at and take payments for the services you were offering. But it required a business bank account, and they wanted to offer their users, the developers of these websites and apps, a way to sign up for a business bank account really easily. So they put a form on their website. And so you would, as a Stripe user, you would go and fill in the form, and it would send an email to a member of their staff, and that member of staff would print out all of these emails, go to their local bank, and open a bank account on your behalf, take all the paperwork, and then send it back to you. Now, this is exactly the same model we used, right? It's a form that sends an email to a person who works for Stripe in this case, and then they do the hard work so that the user doesn't have to worry about opening an account or whatever else. And actually this year in February, Stripe announced a product called Stripe Atlas, which is an API that allows you to properly programmatically open bank accounts and indeed incorporate companies in Delaware, I think. But I think Atlas is not powered by humans, because that would make their APIs really slow. But you know, they've had humans, and now they've replaced their humans with their Atlas product. Or there's Zappos, and we don't hear a lot about Zappos in the UK. But Zappos are a North American shoe retailer. And when they started in 1999, the founders of Zappos used to go around their local shoe shops and take photos with their, I guess it wasn't a smartphone then, it would have been an actual digital camera. Take photos with their digital cameras, put those photos onto their website, and then they would sell them. And people would say, I would like to buy that pair of shoes. And then the Zappos, I think it was shoesite.com then was the name, would go into their local shoe shop and buy the shoes that they'd taken a photo of, and then mail them to the person who'd bought them on their website. And soon they were making enough money that they were able to, you know, convince people to invest in them, and they would buy their own distribution centres and their own warehouses, get their own stock from suppliers, and within about a year they had $1.6 million of revenue from this, you know, people going to a shop and posting photos online. And then in 2009, Amazon bought them for $1.2 billion. So the point is, if you address the user need first, you can worry about the technology later. Because once you've got something working, you can decide if that thing that you're doing by hand is the most important thing to work on, or if actually there's something else off to one side that would be more important to work on. So for example, Stripe. Stripe didn't change their online bank account sign up for years because it wasn't the important thing. It was only, you know, a couple of years later when they were sort of starting to work on Atlas that they got rid of the business bank account sign up and replaced it with something that wasn't humans. And the point is, when you finally automate yourself out of that loop, you know exactly what you need to build because you've been doing it. You've had, or if you haven't directly yourself, you've had people on your team doing the thing, and they can tell you exactly what the problem is. So we've talked a little bit about how we and how some others have addressed their user needs using humans. And actually we've talked a little bit with Stripe and with Zappos, how they moved from using humans to solve the user need to what they did after that. So what next for prison visit bookings? Well, we've done all of this work that's kept our service decoupled, and we've taken over the interface and have been iterating on that and working on the system at our own pace. And we've got this monolith sitting there, taking bookings from the call centre staff. But actually, we've not just been leaving it there. We've been talking to the people who run it and trying to get them to open it up to us. And what we can do is we can look at something that Martin Fowler said. He talked about how you can gradually create a new system around the edges of the old until the old system is strangled. This is the strangler pattern, right? So how do we use the strangler pattern? This is where prison visits was when we last left it. And it's sending some emails, and it's all fine. And what we could do is we could start by pulling out a little API that actually just does the email sending and presents an interface of, I am accepting a booking request to our front end. So our front end can be dedicated to presenting web pages to users. And all of the logic, hard logic in air quotes, of sending emails is done by our API. But then once the people who run our monolith say, actually, yes, we have a way that you can connect to us, however long that takes and however much that costs, we can start testing it. We can start using it for small things. Maybe that's sending 1% of bookings through to it, or validating its decisions on bookings against our call center staff's decisions on bookings, or validating user inputs. Has the user provided us with a name for a prisoner that is actually a prisoner that we know, or a prisoner's number that we know, or something like that. And then once we have that API, we can move some things around, and we can build a staff UI, because we can start pumping traffic through as we know that the connection is good and we know the APIs are stable and all this sort of thing, so that the staff can start making bookings directly with this, because maybe that that API that they've provided now is powerful enough to do that and is fast enough to do that. And at this point, we have all of the users for visit information going through our API. So we can start storing stuff. We can start caching data to make their experience better. But we can also start hoarding it, hoarding that delicious visit data. And at some point, we have all of the new visits, at least, that the monolith has. We have all of the new information that the monolith has. So we can start thinking about maybe turning off the visit information in the monolith because no one else is using it. And if we want to backport the historical data, then yeah, sure, we can do that too. And ultimately, we've become the source of truth, and our API only connects to our monolith for incidental things, non-visit things like lists of prisoners or lists of prisons or these sorts of things. And then once we have that, we can start thinking about what else. Maybe we don't want to connect to that monolith for, is this a valid prisoner number? Maybe we want to have another service that's doing that. And we start strangling out another piece, and we're using our current system as a jumping off point to strangle other bits of the API out. And this is actually something we're starting to do in the Ministry of Justice. We're starting to think about things like prisoners' identities. Who is this prisoner? What are their aliases? Where do they live? This sort of thing. Which sounds creepy now I say it on stage. But it's something that we have to track, because we have to know who these people are that we're looking after. And things like prisoners' monies, because as I said earlier, prisoners have to buy things like shower gel and books and magazines and things like that. And some of these things are more challenging than visits, because they're more deeply ingrained into the monolith. But they're still doable with time and with care, if we carefully pick away at them. And we can repeat this pattern until actually the monolith has nothing left to do and we can think about turning it off. So, as I say, what I'm talking about here is building strangler applications. So, I've told you about how in the Ministry of Justice we bypassed an aging monolith to allow us to deliver an agile service that users loved. I've talked about how other organisations have used humans to power the first versions of their service. And I've suggested a few ways that you can start to use this approach and ultimately start to get rid of your monoliths. This approach that I'm talking about here can get you where you need to be faster, more easily, and with much higher user satisfaction. So, in summary, you should build Strangle applications. But actually, before you think about building Strangle applications, you should use low or no tech solutions first. And actually, really, the important point is that you address the user need first and worry about the technology later. I've been Steve Marshall. Thank you very much. So, as I said, links to slides are there. That URL should work, he says optimistically. And on the last slide, there are a bunch of references which you can look at online. So, in case you hadn't noticed, this session is half the length of the other sessions. So we can either all go and hang out in the pub, or you can ask some questions. There's someone in the middle, maybe. I can't really see because I've got blinding lights.
I find it interesting that the government was prepared to keep funding them when you effectively achieved what they wanted, which was, you got to a point where the system was now working, but you seem to have achieved more funding to carry on strangling the monolith. The government must have wanted that monolith gone.
So yeah, so for anyone who didn't hear, the question was, it's interesting that after we had done what we set out to do and built something for the users, it's interesting that we got funding to carry on and strangle the monolith. Is that fair?
Yeah.
So actually for a while, that wasn't the case. There were maybe 6 months or so that Prison Visits was in maintenance mode, and we have kind of or had at this point, a core team of like cross-product people who work on supporting the products that we don't have necessarily resources to support. And so there was this core group of people who were keeping it running and making small incremental updates to it as it needed them, keeping software versions up to date, making sure it was patched, maybe fixing the odd bit of text or whatever that was out of sync with what we should be saying. But then we realized that actually the monoliths contract was due for renewal, and there's this interesting thing where in government contracts can't be renewed past a certain point, and we're not at that point yet with our monolith, but it's kind of on the horizon, and so we're having to start thinking about what next, where do we go next, and maybe one of the options is that monolith carries on, and we buy the new version of it and upgrade, which, is possibly a pretty good option. But another option is that we rebuild and we focus on other things, and we work it the way that we're talking about here. So yeah, it was ultimately because there actually turns out to be a need, and we had shown through the work that we'd done here that both our visitors and the prison staff were much, much happier with the thing that we were building than they were with the monolith. So we basically, got support that way through showing rather than telling. Any more? Go on. No. So, sorry. Yeah. So the question was, did we find we needed more call center staff to deal with the emails? So it turns out that the call center staff, other than in a few places in the country, so there's, I think, 6 prisons in the Midlands that have a dedicated call center, but all of the other prisons' call centers are actually just office staff who are put on a rota to do call center stuff. And so all of the office staff have the ability to book visits. And so what we found since launching the service, since getting people to do visit booking this way, is that if there's a member of the office staff who's got 5 minutes of downtime, they'll process some bookings. So we get these odd little spikes in certain prisons at sort of midnight and 3 a.m. where someone's coming to the end of their shift and there's no point starting something else because they've only got 15 minutes, and why start an hour-long piece of paperwork? So actually, the load across everyone has been reduced and sort of shared out. So no. I think.
Yeah. Since you can't use guard dogs anymore, can you speak a little bit about security and privacy?
Since we can't use what? Sorry.
You can't use the guard dogs anymore.
Right.
Can you speak a little bit of security and privacy because you're pulling out data off the face?
Right. Let me see if I'm getting this right. Since we can't use guard dogs or aren't using guard dogs and physical security anymore, what are the risks? Is that a fair? Yeah, what are the risks for the data? So the thing is, those guard dogs and that physical security are kind of not really as secure as we think they are. It turns out that there are people who run data centers who could take out a hard drive, for example. And I'm not saying that they would, the people who run our data centers are great, I'm sure. I've never met any of them, I'm sure they're brilliant. But they're not people who work for the Ministry of Justice. They're not even necessarily people who work for the company that supplies the Ministry of Justice with this service. They might be 2 or 3 degrees removed. So it might be that actually this company is paying this data center company to provide a secure data center, and I'm sure it is very secure and firewalls and et cetera, but it still has a network connection into it. It's not really disconnected from the internet. It's connected to a network provided by someone. and probably that network's connected to something. But it uses, typically with these data centers that government has, they use old world techniques. You know, they use boxes in racks with hard drives that are actually in those things. And so someone could take that data. With the cloud, for one, yes, we could encrypt the drives. Yes, we could apply encryption to the box. But someone could then log into the box maybe, if it's not secured properly, or if they're, you know, a data center operations person, they might already have access to that box that maybe they shouldn't have, but they set the box up in the first place because it's a physical box in a rack. Whereas with a lot of cloud services, AWS, for example, or Azure, we're kind of a drop in the ocean, right? We are nothing in terms of the traffic and the data scale that they're using. So for their engineers in their data centers to even find one of our records on one of their drives, because it won't be on one drive, it'll be half here and half over there and half in another building. To even find that physically is harder. And then you've got the encryption that we would have to have there anyway, and the encryption may or may not, because it's in a secure building anyway, so why would we encrypt it? Because it's physically secure. It's not really secure. You know, it's kind of a false sense of security. It's security theatre almost, putting stuff into a data centre that you own and that you contract and you disconnect from the internet, sort of. You know, this is just presenting to us risks that we already had but weren't dealing with, and we're just dealing with them properly. Does that make sense? Any more? I can't see any hands. Oh, there we go. Go on.
My wife works for the Train Office Crystal Service in Scotland.
Oh.
Do you know if any similar stuff is being done in Scotland as Europe across the UK or just in Wales?
So obviously the Scottish government is separate in a lot of ways. I have no idea, frankly. I know that that this service also applies to Wales, but probably doesn't apply to anything in Scotland. Yeah, don't know, sorry. I know very little about the Scottish government, unfortunately. I should. Any more? Yeah? Yep. So the question was how we organised, how many developers would we have, that sort of thing. So, okay. There's, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's GDS at the heart of government. They're a thing unto themselves. They are about 600 people, maybe. And when GDS started, they also sort of started helping building teams in the other government departments. So in the Ministry of Justice, we have a team that used to be called MOJ Digital. We're now something else, I don't know. The digital part of MOJ Digital Technology or something. And that has, I think we're about 200-ish people, but that's of lots of different types. So we've got product strategy people, we've got product owners, we've got user researchers, we've got designers, we've got technical architects, we've got developers, we've got content editors, we've got comms people, all this sort of thing. So in terms of technical people in that group, we've got, I think, I want to say about 10 technical architects now maybe, and maybe something in the region of 50 or 60 developers. And the way that that's organised is each product that we have, that we're working on, has a small focus team that could be anything from, depending on where it is in its life cycle and how big it is, anything from like 4 people, which might be product owner, user researcher, technical architect, delivery manager, or project manager, I guess, might be another way of referring to delivery managers. I'm sure delivery managers would give me a slap for that. Or it might be like some teams I've seen where they have sort of 20 people all working on roughly one thing. And then you've got product owner, business analyst maybe, delivery manager, user researcher or maybe 2, designer or maybe 2, and then maybe a cadre of developers and an architect or two. So it depends. For prison visits, at the moment, I think the team has... so I'm no longer on the prison visits team anymore. And actually, I wasn't on the team when some of this work was happening. I came in just before prison visits went live. And the team at the moment has a technical architect, product owner, delivery manager, business analyst, 3 back-end developers, 1 front-end, and I think that's it. At the time that some of this was happening, they had me and a back-end developer and a front-end developer and an ops person, and then product owner and delivery manager and designer and user researcher. So yeah, it varies a little bit, but it's always a cross-functional team working on one product. So, you have prison visits booking, or apply for an employment tribunal, or apply for a lasting power of attorney, and each of those things will have a group of people who are focused on that. If not full-time, then a good percentage of their time, like 50% or something like that. Yeah?
What challenges did you have communicating ideas about stakeholders?
So the question was, what challenges did we have communicating ideas of architecture to old worldy government stakeholders? Lots. Lots and lots and lots, and we still have lots. There are a lot of very, very good people in the old world, as we refer to it. They know a lot of stuff. They have a lot of good ideas, but often they haven't necessarily been exposed to some of the things that some of us might have been. So, for example, the idea of the public cloud, for example, because we host prison visits in the public cloud. We host prison visits in AWS. It scares them because they haven't thought about the implications of, well, actually your data is sharded across 4 billion commodity hard drives that AWS just manages for you, and then the way you deal with that is by encrypting it heavily. They haven't thought about that. So their conception of it is the same. They take their mental model of, I have a computer with a hard drive in a data center that someone could walk to and take away, and they kind of transplant that often into the new model. And it takes a lot of time and effort and talking to, and showing them documentation or asking them questions, understanding the way they're thinking about things. And that's the key of it, right? One of the most fascinating things I've learned while I've been at the Ministry of Justice is from my colleagues who are user researchers, because it's not really something I'd been exposed to that much. Because one of the rules we have is that everyone on the team has to go to at least 2 hours of user research every 6 weeks. And watching a user researcher work is fascinating, because they know just the right questions, or they figure out just the right questions to ask someone for that person to explain how they think about something. And the questions won't be loaded, they won't lead that person down one avenue or another. They will be completely unbiased, and that person will give you their honest opinion and their honest understanding of the world, and it allows you to get closer to what they think the world looks like and how they think the world is shaped. And asking those kinds of questions of these old world architects is really, really useful, because then you can start to unpick what it is they want. And sometimes actually they become your biggest advocates. And we've had that in a few cases where people have realised that maybe they're not going to be architects anymore, they're going to be some other role. They go on to be, I don't know, a product owner or a business owner because they've been embroiled in this world for 10 years, say. But maybe they're a product owner and they then realise that we should be forging a path to bright new futures of blockchains and Node or something, I don't know. So yeah, a lot of it is about having the humility to know that these people aren't just there because they've weaseled themselves in. They're there because at some point the things that they were saying were the accepted wisdom, and they do know some stuff. They know some stuff. But it's just that they've been working so hard on this thing that maybe what we're doing has passed them by, or maybe actually technology is not their first love. So it's about that, a lot of it. It's about talking to them and understanding what it is that worries them and where their concerns are. And having reasonable arguments. Or, having the courage to say, do you know what? I actually don't know the answer to this problem, but I will look at it and maybe we can work it out together. What else? Go on.
So you put to the internet something that's supposedly connected with, supposedly I'm saying, to
Yep.
high secure things and so on. So this is very attractive for the people who try their key thoughts. So did you have any problems with people like trying intentionally break the system?
Yeah, we did. So one of the things, sorry, yeah, I keep forgetting to repeat the question. So the question was, did we, we're presenting something that potentially looks like it's presenting a publicly accessible interface to secure data. Did we have any problems with people trying to attack us? Is that a fair summary? Yeah. And the answer is yes. Yes, we have that problem. It turns out that when you're dealing with prisons, you're dealing with some people who are actually criminals. Maybe not all of them, but certainly there are a percentage of the prison population who are criminals. And a percentage of that population are connected to organised crime, potentially. And some of organised crime have, incentives to game the system or to attack the system or whatever else. But one of the things that we have to do in government is we have to go through a bunch of certification. And one of the things that GDS is doing is actually trying to make this certification more modern. But one of my first jobs, actually, when I started at the Ministry of Justice was working with our pen testers, with our penetration testers, our security testing external contractor to test the prison visit booking service. Now, what they didn't know at the time was that we had also just hired an ethical hacker, really, really talented person who has actually written some really interesting blog posts on the Ministry of Justice's blog. Really recommend you go and read them. And she had also attacked the system, and she'd done what they call grey box testing. So she'd kind of done some testing with no access beforehand and broken things and all that sort of thing. And some testing from the inside where she gave herself access through means that a hacker wouldn't have and tested it that way. And she'd already sort of said, well, actually, you forgot this permission here and you forgot that connection there. But because it's a human interface, there's not actually that much there. There's not much that anyone can attack. But we have had, we've had people doing things like trying to brute force identifying prisoners' information through the service. We've had people trying to, work out if they can game a booking, if they can get a booking that they shouldn't necessarily have, because they know the prisoner's name and they know roughly when they were born. So let's brute force their prisoner identification number and let's brute force their date of birth in the month that we know they were born, and then we can book a visit to them. But we've got that human element there, and those humans are looking at, actually, there's 4,000 visits coming in for this person. Maybe they're all fake. And even if they weren't, they also have the ability to look in the prison database and say, actually, this person who's trying to book a visit isn't allowed to see this person because there's, some rivalry there, for example's sake. They've had an argument in the past, and the person who's trying to visit was inside at one point with this person, and they had a fight, let's say. But we've got that human element there, and one of the complexities actually of connecting to the monolith that we're working on right now is how we replicate that human intelligence. And machine learning and AI is not necessarily the way to do it. There are, bits of logic that you can apply to this problem. But, how do you identify those sorts of problems? And it's actually, when we're doing the connections, that's something we're working on. But yeah, we have people attacking the services regularly and trying to break it, but we scale the services out when they need to be. If we can't handle it, we just take them down for a little while, because, you know, 1.5 million bookings over a year and a half or 2 years isn't that much. You know, it's not like we're taking down Amazon.com, right? Or not like we're taking down the GovUK homepage. That's a different matter. You know, we can't turn that off. We couldn't turn GovUK, or GDS couldn't turn GovUK. We don't have any control. We couldn't turn it off if we wanted to. GDS couldn't turn GovUK off for 10 minutes or 15 minutes in the middle of the day. If we were under attack and it wasn't handling the attack well, we could do that. And a few people would phone up the phone lines instead. You know, we have that other option if we need it. But yeah, we get attacked. But it's not that much of a problem because we've done a lot of testing. We have spent a lot of time doing penetration testing and things like that. I saw another hand over there.
Yeah, do you use any blocking algorithms to detect prisoners laying out prisoners coming in, or things such as, you know, gang violence, you know, somebody coming in with a grievance, looking for one person, they can then, you know, get access to somebody else in prison and actually.
So I missed the thing that you said. Do we use any? Oh, right. Okay. So the question was, do we use any graphing or anything like that? You know, any of those sorts of technologies to identify relationships with visitors? You know, having incidents with other visitors or gang violence between prisoners or anything like that. So funny story. The one incident that we have had with prison visits is that there was a guy who was seeing two women on the outside. And they both had the same first name, it turns out. And he sent the wrong person the wrong visiting order form. And so they found out about one another, and they colluded with one another to visit him on the same day. And a fight ensued. But that's the one security incident we have had in the 2 years since the service has been live. More generally across the prison service, there are some systems, yes, that, you know, provide information and work out these sorts of connections. But mostly it's human intelligence, right? It is mostly the prison guards know that this guy and this guy, because it is mostly guys, let's be honest. You know, there are prisons for women, but the vast majority of the prison population is young men. You know, but they know that this guy and this guy have had a fight, or that they had an argument because of something or other. And so they communicate. But they also log this information on some systems, and so security teams can look at this and they can do evaluations on it. Honestly, my knowledge kind of starts to tail off there. As I understand it, they do have some specialist tooling to look at patterns and these sorts of things, but mostly it's human intelligence. And one of the things that we're looking at now is how we help them with that and how we give them modern tools to say, oh, look, there's a pattern here and here. And actually, one of the other projects I've been working on, send money to a prisoner, one of the tools that we've bought allows the prison staff to say, show me all of the money that has been received by prisoners that has a non-integer value of pounds. So, you know, 41 pence or 13 pence or 12 pence or something like that. Because sometimes, not always, but sometimes people who are trading in, you know, illicit substances or, you know, illicit goods in prison use that sort of thing as code. So if they receive £5.31, they know to release, you know, whatever it is, the pack of cigarettes that they're illicitly trading to the person in cell 31. Maybe, that sort of thing, you know. So there is some of that sort of stuff, and we are helping build a lot of tools like that. What else? Any more? And I can't see anyone over here, so if you are sticking your hands up, I'm really sorry, but you'll have to jump up and down or something. No? All good? Everyone happy? Lunch won't be ready till it's supposed to be in 20 minutes or half an hour or whatever that is. Sorry about that, I can't fix that. But maybe you can go and throw things at the other presenters. Don't. Be nice. They're all great. Don't throw things at them. Thank you all very much.